All right, so let's talk Venom: The Last Dance. This is going to be a non-spoiler and spoiler review of Venom: The Last Dance. So if you haven't seen the film, no worries. That's exactly what the non-spoiler part is going to be for. If you have seen the film, though, just stick around, and I'll clearly delineate when the spoiler section is going to start, and then we'll be talking spoilers there. So if you haven't seen the film yet, then just feel free to hop off there or save the video for later, and you can come back and watch the spoiler section at that point. And yeah, let's get into it, guys. Venom: The Last Dance. So Venom, just to give some context about my own personal opinions about the series thus far, I've for the most part enjoyed the Venom series. I really actually found a lot of enjoyment with the first Venom film. It quite surprised me. I know that it doesn't have a super high critic rating or anything like that, but again, it was a film that I watched a few times when it came out, and I was like, this is really fun, honestly. And really what sold me about the first Venom film, because it is sort of a generic kind of comic booky, early 2000s, 2010s kind of comic book film. But the dynamic between Eddie Brock and Venom, it was just something special about it. Something that Tom Hardy alone could bring to that role that I really enjoyed. Venom: Let There Be Carnage, I've said this before, I don't think the film is terrible by any means. In fact, I may not even say it's a bad film. I just think it was kind of just not as good, if that makes sense. I don't know. I don't want to say inferior, or I don't want to say, again, I just don't want to say it's a bad film, in my opinion. I just think that it had so much missed potential, and it felt like a very condensed, watered down version of Venom. But again, I didn't hate it. I just didn't love it. So I went into Venom: The Last Dance. Critics had been saying it's the best one of the three. I really, people really enjoyed it. Some people really didn't enjoy it. It has something like a 38% Rotten Tomatoes by the time I'm recording this review. So a lot of mixed opinions about the film. But again, the first Venom film also had something like a 37% Rotten Tomatoes. So I went in, again, as always, with an open mind, completely open mind, to watch Venom: The Last Dance. And here's what I will say. This is, I think, my least favorite Venom film of the three. I think as a film, right? And I don't mean to get all, snobby and film criticky. That's not who I am. Obviously, I'm not a film critic. I'm a fan, right? I'm just a fan talking about movies. But I think from the metrics that most critics would observe this film as, and things even that I care about, like story and acting and writing and things like that, this is probably the worst Venom film. That being said, it still has elements of what make the first Venom film especially really good. And so did Venom: Let There Be Carnage, in fairness. I think what it comes down to is just sort of a law of diminishing returns. I think each Venom sequel, to me, tried to recapture what made the first Venom film really special, and it was able to grasp parts of it, right? Obviously, this film, it was written by, both Venom: Let There Be Carnage, the first Venom, and Venom: The Last Dance were written by Kelly Marcel, who is now the director of Venom: The Last Dance. So it's not like, the original writers left and then there were just people scrambling to try to figure out what happened. It is still the same writers, the same people who made the first film. It's just something so special about that origin story that is just missing here. And it's just the law of diminishing returns, right? I think that this is, in terms of things that you look for in a film, because I think there are scenes in here that are really fun. And a lot of them you see in the trailers, right? And the trailers make it kind of look like a slapstick comedy. But honestly, the slapstick comedy, buddy road trip kind of movie elements of the film are the best parts. I think I would say from the 20-minute mark to about the 45 to an hour minute mark were pretty fun, just because they were focusing on the relationship between Eddie and Venom. But then the film, when it tries to take itself seriously, I think falls completely on its face. And it's unfortunate. It's not atrocious or anything like that, but it's just not great, because there are a lot of things they're trying to do here. It tries to take itself seriously at certain points. It's not just a complete comedy, it's not trying to be completely slapstick or anything like that, but it just transitions so jarringly back and forth between those two elements that I think it just, when it tries to end, right, it tries to conclude and wrap not just this film, but it tries to wrap the entire trilogy in a nice bow. It doesn't stick the landing, in my opinion. So let's go into some specifics here. I think that, again, the dynamic between Eddie and Venom are what hold up the film, and really what make the parts of that middle section so strong is just the dynamic between Eddie and Venom, where you get to see, I think, the bond that those two characters have developed over the last three films. It's really special to have seen. And again, what I've said in my my post, I did a community tab post right after I saw the film, is that while I think this is the weakest film of the three, I still think there are scenes and sequences between those two characters in particular that I'll probably still watch on YouTube long after this film has come out. I think that that part of the film, these filmmakers, the writer Kelly Marcel, they all have a really good understanding of what's going on here. You know, how to write these two characters. I mean, and this is spoiling something very minor that was in the trailers. So if you haven't seen the trailers and you don't want to know anything, that's totally fine. But just skip ahead maybe 15 seconds. But the whole Venom horse, Venom fish, Venom frog, you know, like that sequence where they're running away in the river, that was really fun, really good. The Venom horse sequence, I was surprised at actually how funny it was, because in the trailers it just didn't look that interesting or that funny, didn't really land. But in the movie, really quite good. There are a couple other sequences that honestly I can totally understand why some other people would find really cringe. And you know, there's one particular storyline. I'm sure if you've seen the film, you're gonna know immediately what I'm talking about. There's one particular storyline that the film invests so much of its time in that I think 80% of it is pretty terrible, honestly. Like pretty, just unnecessary, honestly. But it almost felt like they needed to fill time and do something else, and so they decided to add in the subplot. But I will say there's a sequence, you know, towards the beginning of the second act where, not spoiling anything at all, but just, you know, Venom and Eddie are kind of contemplating, and there's this sort of dynamic between, like, you know, have a good time, enjoy life. And I think that it actually works really well. I can understand there's something specific that happens here that I understand why critics really wouldn't like it, but I think that for me, I understood the sentimentality that it was going for, and that's sort of the emotional part of the film that worked better for me than other parts, because especially towards the end, like I said, you know, the beginning of the film, a little bit all over the place. Honestly, most of the film, in terms of pacing, I think pacing is one of the worst and least well executed parts of this film. Pacing is all over the place, because you'll switch from a really slapstick kind of Tom and Jerry-esque dynamic between Venom and Eddie to then something very serious where Chiwetel Ejiofor is trying to deliver some military speech and he's trying to be serious, and then you cut back to Venom doing something crazy, you know, in Vegas, and then you'll cut back to Chiwetel Ejiofor and Juno Temple trying to be serious in a lab. It's just the pacing is so frenetic, and they're trying to condense all these things into such a small amount of time, because the film isn't that long. The film could have honestly stood to have been maybe 10 minutes longer, because it's just diving between everything so quickly. I mean, the very first scene of the movie is written so hastily, and it's trying to condense all of this stuff that's going on. Again, not to spoil anything, nothing is being spoiled here, but just the first 5 minutes, they're trying to condense all this stuff into something like 2 minutes of time, and then they move on very quickly to the next thing. And it's just, it makes the film feel so rushed that by the time you're actually getting into a groove, you're actually enjoying it, you're like, wait, that's it? And, you know, like I said, it doesn't really bode well for a film that, like, the parts that you want to be good are so quick, and then the parts that are just not landing aren't landing, right? And so, again, the character dynamic between Eddie and Venom, strong as ever, and honestly, they go even further into the goofy. But honestly, I don't mind that, because when it's just Eddie and when it's just Venom together, I think that's fun. Doesn't really matter. They could do anything, honestly, and it'd be fun for me. But then there are other things that are happening on screen, like, you know, Chiwetel Ejiofor and Juno Temple are playing two characters that just take themselves super seriously, and that's fine. I mean, there's an attempted backstory for one of those characters that just doesn't really matter in the story, and it's fine. Like I said, there's this entire other subplot that they tried to insert in this film that reminds me of another thing in a superhero film that I'll explain in the spoiler discussion. Just didn't work for me, honestly. They spent way too much time on this subplot that was just bogging the film down, in my opinion. And then the ending was cool. There was some cool stuff going on in the ending, although I think that they went a little too heavy in one direction. Again, we'll talk about that in the spoiler discussion. That just didn't, you know, it was cool to look at, but in terms of the scope, it was like, yeah, we're just throwing everything against the wall. But, you know, cool to look at. But ultimately it didn't land. And by the time they wanted to land that emotional punch, it was like, it's a little too late for that. And again, at the end of the film, they try to wrap up the whole trilogy in such a way that, you know, it tries to feel grand and everything like that. And for me, I was like, look, I've enjoyed my time with these characters. You know, and that's not to say anything about the film itself. It's just, you know, Tom Hardy has said, this is my last Venom film. Totally fine. You know, he's done a great service with this character, and I've enjoyed my time here. And would I love to see just some short films every once in a while with Eddie and Venom and what they're up to and whatnot, or even their adventures between films? Sure, for sure. But, you know, I think that the juice has kind of run out of this franchise. I think the first film was such a high, and then from here, they just kind of ran out of steam. So those, you know, I think that at the end of the day, again, this is probably my least favorite Venom film, but Doesn't mean that I didn't enjoy certain parts of it. Ultimately, though, I think I'm satisfied with my time in this universe, and I would not be super disappointed if there wasn't another one of these, just because I think that the concept and the execution have kind of run out of steam at this point. But guys, that will do it for the non-spoiler discussion for Venom: The Last Dance, and we're going to transition now into full spoilery detail here. I'm going to go over some of my predictions that I made, some of the expectations that I had for Venom: The Last Dance in the last episode of Access Blockbusters Pod, and see how much I got right, and some of the expectations that I had, and whether or not they were fulfilled, or whether or not I was disappointed by them. So we are going to transition now into spoilers. If you haven't seen Venom: The Last Dance, just click off now and come back later. And yeah, here we go. So the subplot, I wanted to start out with the subplot here because I think that just kind of unexpectedly, I didn't even know it was Rhys Ifans who played Dr. Connors in the Amazing Spider-Man films and Spider-Man No Way Home. I didn't know that he was, what's his name, Martin? The weird, not weird, just kind of the strange family subplot that was going on there. And I was saying earlier that there was a sequence that I think a lot of other critics would not have liked, but I enjoyed. It was the karaoke scene when they're singing the Major Tom song. And I mean, look, at first was I like, this is a little cringy? For sure. I was not super on board with it at first, but I think once I realized what they were going for here and how I think that there is this really tender dynamic that was being built there between Eddie and Venom that they explored a lot in that sequence when they're on the road. And I think that made that sequence work for me. It worked for me quite well. So I enjoyed that. I enjoyed his dynamic just, with the family when he first meets them. And I enjoyed the whole sequence, like I mentioned, with Venom Frog and Venom Fish and Venom Horse. I think the Venom Horse stuff was really funny. Really funny. Like it bordered on silly and Warner Brothers cartoon humor, but I don't know. I think it's really fun. Like, what is this film for if not for that kind of stuff? You know what I mean? Where Venom is just pulling and yanking at Eddie around and doing all these crazy things with him. I think it's fun. I think it's really fun. Like I said at the beginning, right? Knull. The first scene of the film is Knull, and it's just Knull talking to the audience, basically. I know it's sort of meant to be Knull giving a grand exposition speech to somebody, to the xenophages or whatever, but it's basically Knull talking to the audience and being like, I am here, I am Knull, fear me, conquer, whatever. And I was like, oh, okay. Really hastily written, didn't feel earned at all, and it just kind of felt bizarre and out of nowhere. I will say the xenophages were pretty cool, honestly. I like I said, I appreciated Venom not just fighting symbiotes the entire movie, and honestly, I actually appreciated a lot that the symbiotes were fighting together. I think that is something new that we haven't seen in the first two films, and I really enjoyed that. So that was good. The attempted backstory with Juno Temple, I don't know. It belonged in a different film, honestly, and they didn't explore that at all. Chiwetel Ejiofor was in and out for a paycheck, honestly, and I don't blame him for that. I think that that's totally fine. I don't blame him. I just think he was in and out he probably filmed for like 2 weeks and then was out, because that's about how many scenes he had in the film. Tom Hardy again gives it his all. Some of the stuff, right? Like Vegas was funny. The slot machine was funny. Mrs. Chen, that entire sequence was so ridiculous. That was honestly, the Mrs. Chen stuff was the straw that broke the camel's back for me. Because not just from a logic standpoint, from a logic standpoint, for sure. Because, how is Mrs. Chen in Vegas? How do you just run into the one person who ran the convenience store that you visited all the time in San Francisco? How does that happen? It doesn't make sense. Okay, fine. But what was more egregious to me from a logic perspective was that Venom decides to turn into Venom, and he knew at that point that the xenophage was going to go after him, and he still did it anyways. And it totally screamed, writer doesn't know how to write their way into the next scene. They're going to make the character do something absurdly dumb and hope that no one in the audience notices. And if that didn't bother you, totally fine. But it really bothered me. At that point, I was like, what are we doing here? That's such bad writing, in my opinion, right? If it doesn't bother you, it doesn't bother you. In my opinion, though, I sat there and I was like, he knew the xenophage was going to go after him because of the Codex, which the Codex is the Codex. It's dumb. I watched Transformers 1, and I'm not a Transformers fan, so I don't know the lore. The whole, the Matrix of Leadership, that's also kind of dumb. But it's in a good movie, in my opinion. And so it didn't really bother me in that sense. But the Codex in this film, I was like, why have we not known about this before? But whatever. It honestly wasn't the biggest egregious thing about the film. And then the ending, look, the ending was cool with the symbiotes fighting the xenophages and whatnot. It was cool. But ultimately at the end, I think that it was a little bit too much visual noise and not a lot of anything else. And it's a cool sequence. Like I'm sure I'll be able to watch it on YouTube later on, just like how sometimes I'll watch the Carnage and Venom fights and the Venom Riot fight. It's cool visuals for sure. But at the end of the day, just not a whole lot there. Julia Taylor-Ejiofor just kind of dies. And look, the emotion at the end, the sentimentality with Venom dying, I think I would have appreciated it a little more if it came with a little bit more of a heartfelt movie in general, because the movie just didn't feel like, it felt so rushed and so poorly paced, and I don't know. It felt kind of weird to me. That all of a sudden we were going to sit in this emotional space, and after we had done so much slapstick comedy for the most part, and then this kind of B-level superhero movie, military guys going after the symbiote kind of thing, it just didn't land as well as I wanted it to, because there is a world in which I felt tons of emotion for this scene, and it just didn't quite land for me at the end. And even just having memories play at the end, and then Eddie going to the Statue of Liberty, it just felt really cheesy somehow and didn't really feel like it landed the punch that it wanted to, and I was really disappointed by that. Now, rounding out this spoiler review, I wanted to talk about Knull, and then we'll get to my predictions and expectations, and we'll see how well they lined up with the film. Knull was not a character in this movie. He didn't need to be in the movie at all. I don't know why he was in the movie, other than just to be like, Knull's here and King in Black, because honestly, guys, I think whatever plans they had for Knull, I don't think it's happening unless it's in Spider-Man 4, in which case, because, yeah, I mean, I talked all about this in my last week's podcast about how, why would Kevin Feige bet everything he has on one of the biggest franchises he has in the MCU, in the Spider-Man franchise, on the Sony universe by bringing in Knull and all the implications that he had? Because Knull was, he was fine in this movie, but he wasn't even in the movie. So, I'm assuming King in Black was going to be a whole Sony universe thing, and after Madam Web, after Morbius, after this, and unless Kraven the Hunter wins a bunch of Oscars, I don't think the Sony Universe experiment is going to last much longer. I think they're going to pivot to other things like Spider-Man Noir and, I don't know, Silk maybe, or the Silk TV show that was going to happen. So, yeah, whatever plans they had for Knull, I just have a hard time believing they're going to move forward, especially with the critic reaction. And I don't know that this film is going to do super well financially. We'll see, but poor word of mouth, and I think people are kind of over the novelty of this. I don't know. I just don't think we're going to see Knull that much in the future. But I could be wrong. Maybe he'll be the villain of Kraven the Hunter for all I know. So there is that. But guys, to round out this episode, this review of Venom the Last Dance, we're going to go through my expectations and predictions from last week and see how much I got right and how, if my expectations were met. So going through my hopes and expectations first, what I wanted from the film first was not too much silly and off the rails. And I just wanted it to have a heartfelt story and a very solid kind of through line. And like I said, I don't think that the film really achieved that. I think that the humor, it went very silly, but it worked for me for the most part. Especially, again, the Venom horse stuff was really funny for me. But ultimately, the story was not the strong suit of this film. Second expectation and hope was not too many symbiotes. And what I meant more by that, honestly, was, don't have symbiotes fighting symbiotes. So it achieved that. But there were a lot of symbiotes for sure. So yeah, there is that. Didn't bother me as much as I thought it would, though. And then the last expectation I had was let the story be about Eddie and Venom at the core. I don't think it really was. It kind of was, but it kind of wasn't. And so I'm a little disappointed by that. So yeah, kind of disappointed by the expectations. Now, for my predictions, number 1, Venom the Last Dance makes in the ballpark, right, of $600 million. I said between $550 and $650 million. I don't think that's going to happen. I think that the word of mouth is not strong enough where it's gonna carry the film to that height. And I think that, again, the first Venom film, sure, made $800 million plus dollars, but I think there was just some kind of novelty that is just not there anymore with this Venom franchise. And I wouldn't be surprised if this tops out at about $400 million, maybe even a little bit less, but we'll see. We'll see. Second prediction, though, I nailed it. Knull is not in the movie for more than 10 minutes. He was in the movie for like 3 minutes, honestly. And yeah, I don't know what I was expecting, honestly. I kind of expected him to be in the shadows more often, and he was just sitting in prison for the whole movie. So there was that. Number 3, Venom and Eddie both die. I will give myself a half point. Venom did die, but I did say Venom and Eddie would die. So I'm at 1.5 out of 2 technically, but probably 1.5 out of 3 given what happens to the box office. And finally, number 4, I think this was a big no-brainer. Spider-Man and really any of the other Sony Universe characters do not show up in the film, for sure. I mean, unless you're going to count that very brief moment where they kind of recreated that scene from the end of Spider-Man No Way Home in the post-credit scene. That doesn't really count for me. So yeah, I did get that one right as well. I just don't see Knull appearing in Spider-Man 4 next. I could be wrong. It could totally be called Spider-Man 4 King in Black, but I just don't see it. But we'll have to see. Stranger things have happened. I mean, there was a world, where none of us were expecting this whole multiversal thing to happen in Spider-Man No Way Home. And it did, and so we'll see. But guys, those were my thoughts on Venom The Last Dance. We'll be talking a little bit more about it, I'm sure, in future episodes of the podcast. But for now, let me know what you guys thought about Venom The Last Dance, in the comments down below. I'd love to hear your guys' thoughts, and let me know, what you thought about the film. Was it your favorite, your least favorite, the middle one out of the trilogy? Let me know in the comments.